Look more at the discussions taking place at today's Cyber Roundtable. Let's bring in Rob Potter. He's the co-founder and CEO of Internet 2.0. Rob, great to see you as always. Do you like what you're hearing from the government in terms of some of these proposed changes in the wake of the breaches of Medibank and Optus last year?
Yeah, I do. I think they're a very positive step in the right direction, mostly because what we're seeing is the machinery of government changing because we now have a cybersecurity minister. So previously this was all run from the ACSC, and the lesson learned from that was that cybersecurity probably needed a voice in cabinet. In the United States, it certainly has a higher profile and a more centralised position in the government. And it's the same case in the UK. So what Australia is doing is essentially adopting the lessons learned from other countries and then bringing those powers into the ministry and then aligning a government department with a coordinator working directly to a cybersecurity minister. So that it really makes sense from just how you need to run a government when you have a minister running things instead of a public servant.
And is it also, Rob, important for, well, there's two facets to it, isn't there? You've got the coordination of government departments and roles, but then you've got the reaction, the response in the face of a crisis, I guess just as important at that moment.
Exactly right. So at the state levels, they've actually already done this in a number of ways. So like in New South Wales government, Maria Milosavljevic, when she was set up as Australia's first whole-of-government Chief Information Security Officer, she coordinated a lot of this through the Department of Premier and Cabinet. The same thing happened in Victoria. So the federal government's following that same roundtable whole-of-government, but now also whole-of-industry approach, because unlike a lot of countries in the world which run state-owned enterprises that manage the critical infrastructure in their country. In Australia, the majority of critical infrastructure, it sits in the private sector. So it's inevitable that these institutions need to talk to the private sector. And it's never been completely obvious that intelligence agencies like ASD, like GCHQ or the NSA, they're very good at being intelligence agencies, but they're not necessarily great at being the best voice to talking to the rest of the business community, because their instinct is usually to hold information to themselves. That's not their fault. It's just a cultural thing, which is why we've sort of experimented with having the ACSE doing a lot of public evangelism, but now we're really experimenting by having a coordinator with the powers to actually get things done. So when we look back at the Medibank attack, and we look at how information was shared during that, government was under a lot of restrictions, and so was the private sector. So, for example, if Medibank wanted to share the customer details of people who'd been impacted with their telco or with their financial institution to say, hey, put an alert on this person's account, they couldn't do it directly, because Australian law actually, the way the privacy laws at the moment currently roll around, that actually isn't possible for the private sector to do it that way. They have to go back through government. So a coordinator is necessary, but there's the reform that needs to happen so that we can react as a community of industry, the private sector and intelligence agencies together in a way that best protects people in a crisis. Because at the moment, the lessons learned of previous breaches is that we haven't quite got the communications right. And that's not necessarily the fault of previous governments, because they'd built pipes, but they hadn't tested the water flow through them. And now, having that happened in the last 6 to 12 months, we've got a lot more data to decide how best to run government and cybersecurity.
And this is correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but these are some of the world first laws in this space in terms of world leading legislation. So it makes sense that they're going to have to change as we go. And one of the things the Minister said today, which I'm interested in your thoughts on, was that she said that the legislation as it sits at the moment means that the government and our agencies can only go in to an organisation during the breach itself, during the critical moment, as opposed to the fallout where if you've got data breaches of people's details and so on, it's not just the immediate 48 hours. You need to have access for weeks.
Absolutely. So the first 48 hours of a cyber attack are the most important because that's when you can prevent loss. But as we saw after Medibank, preventing loss, once you failed at that stage, there's a whole lot of stuff that needs to happen with informing people, with ensuring that you're compliant with privacy regulations, with letting people know that their information is out there, that bad guys have it, and that they need to take steps to protect themselves. Getting that done quickly is just as important, and it doesn't happen right during the breach. So what we're seeing here is the government's learning from the experience of this. That's what the industry roundtable was pulled together to do, was to get some of the best thought leadership in Australia, also to draw on other international experience to bring these coordinating bodies together. And everywhere that I've seen that this works well, be it at the state government levels where this is actually practiced pretty regularly, and internationally where the United States is a thought leader in the space, they run things very similarly to how the government is proposing to do things now here.
When we hear also the potential broadening of what's described as critical infrastructure, or the remit of the security of critical infrastructure, the suggestion is that the report from Andy Penn and others suggests that adding customer data in the definition of critical assets, that would take in a whole range of more businesses, wouldn't it, in terms of those who might be subject to government intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. Because what we've worked out is that customer data, if there's enough of it, can be a national security risk. Because some of the data sets that are out there, we're talking about the names, addresses and phone numbers of some very sensitive people. And this huge amount of private information that we now have out there is starting to become something that we as a country need to defend from not just an everyday user point of view, but as an aggregate, increasing the level of vulnerability to our country if these credentials are out there. So bringing that into the remit of critical infrastructure, I think, is a good lessons learned. But we're going to see that the definition of critical infrastructure slowly expands over time, because government will be drawn into the expectation that it, because of the shortage of cybersecurity skills, will be the provider of choice for expertise, and it will find itself getting dragged into more cases. Because if you're sitting in a medium-sized enterprise or a medium-sized bank, you can still be critical infrastructure, but the shortage of cyber talent that sits in the market at the moment means that government, large banks, large telcos will monopolise a lot of the access to talent. And so those medium-sized enterprises are going to look to government for resourcing as well in a crisis, because there just aren't enough people to go around in a really serious situation.
Those workforce shortages are huge. I know we've spoken about it with you before. I just want to finally pick up something that Michael Pezzullo, the Secretary of Home Affairs, said in October last year. Of the Optus breach, he said he wasn't downplaying it, but in terms of the risks we're trying to manage, there are, regrettably, I have to say, more catastrophic, more consequential and darker scenarios that can easily be painted that could well unfold. Now, that comment made in October of last year, I guess he's talking about state actors and real incursions on our infrastructure. How well equipped are we to try and combat such a scenario?
Well, Secretary Pezzullo is really speaking to the reality that our international partners in other countries have already faced those sorts of threats. And we can't just learn from the experience of the breaches that happen here, like Medibank and Optus. We also can look to internationally to see situations like the Colonial Pipeline hack, where power systems and fuel systems were impacted by a ransomware attack. So those sorts of scenarios are what we should be planning for and learning from, because while we are a country with a set of regulations, a set of businesses, and more than enough of our own infrastructure to take care of, if we don't look at global examples for our worst case scenario planning, then we won't learn from the lessons of other countries. And so adopting some of those measures, like Secretary Pezzullo is really talking to there, particularly I can think of some amazing examples out of Ukraine in 2014, which they learned from very quickly, where power systems were disrupted by wiper attacks from Russia that actually successfully knocked off major power segments of the country. We want to make sure that those attacks aren't able to be replicated in Australia and that we're a harder target. But in aggregate, Australia is a market leader in cyber defence. We're also a market leader in cyber attacking of bad guys. ASD is a world leader in actually hacking some of these adversaries and understanding how they operate ahead of time. But taken together, there's still a lot more we can do. Just because we're towards the front of the maturity pack globally doesn't mean we're anything like ready for the level of threat that we face, especially given that the acute workforce shortage applies globally and it impacts on our ability to understand and defend our critical infrastructure.
Rob Potter, co-founder and CEO at Internet 2.0. Great to get your insights as always. Thank you.